Hello, everyone. Welcome to the fourth episode of Urbanlogue webinar series, Shaping Streets for People. I'm Archana Menon, and I will be your moderator for today's session. Today's episode focuses on the design of streets that put people above vehicles, with a special focus on projects that enable non-motorized transportation, that is walking and cycling. We have three panelists today, and I'll introduce them one by one. Venugopal AV, a research associate of ITDP India program. He's been coordinating with GCC and other external institutions for a lot of complete streets projects of ITDP. And he is currently now working with the Chennai administration to create a citywide network for walking and cycling. Welcome, Venu. Sanskriti Menon, the Senior Program Director of Center for Environment and Education. Her work involves urban transportation, participatory governance, and she is involved in the creation of Pune's Cycle Plan. Hello, Sanskriti, a warm welcome to you. Raj Cherubal, he is the CEO of Chennai Smart City Limited, and he has joined us in our studio today. His primary area of focus is pedestrians and pedestrianization. It is under his tenure that Chennai will launch its first pedestrian plaza. So warm welcome to you, Raj. So before we start, I'll walk you through a broad structure of today's webinar. Venugopal will present for 15 minutes, and this is followed by a panel discussion with Raj, Sanskriti, and Venu, which will be moderated by me. After which we will have a Q&A session that will be open to the participants or the audience. A few housekeeping rules for the people who joined us for the first time. You can chat and interact with each other in the chat box, but please put your questions in the Q&A panel. Type your questions there through the webinar, and it will be answered at the end of our session. If you like a question that somebody else has written, you can upvote it. The question with the most votes will be answered at the end. Thank you all for joining in. I now hand this over to Venugopal for his presentation.
Thank you, Archana, for the lovely introduction. Hi, Sanskriti, hi, Raj, and a big hi to everyone listening in to this webinar. So let's begin with a very quick exercise and see the things that you observe. So I'll be taking you all through three images of streets, and I would like you all to observe these three elements. In each picture, what are the different kinds of activities that you see? What are the different kinds of people that you see in a picture? And what are the elements do you find in this picture that connect and make the picture what it is? So make a mental note in each picture as you go by. All right. So here is the first one. So this is a street in Amritsar, a largely pedestrianized street next to the Golden Temple. So the three elements, the different kinds of people that you see, what are the activities they are doing, and what else do you see in this picture? Moving to the next one. This is a street in Milan, Italy. The same three elements, the different kinds of people, the activities they're indulging in, and the different elements in the picture that connects all of this together. And the last one, a typical market street in India, the different people, the activities, and the different other elements that you see in the picture. All right, so these are some points that I saw and I listed, and I'm sure that many of you might have found something else altogether. But just to strike things off, there were activities from people selling things, walking, reading, playing, clicking pictures. You had a wide range of people, from children to families to shopkeepers, different age groups, faiths. And you had many elements for these people to interact with and to guide them, like signages, light posts, vending carts. You had statues, you had a lot of congestion in the last picture. So these are the different elements that I observed in the picture. So keeping these observations in mind and the many cities that all of you might have traveled to, what do you think exactly makes a city what it is? Is it the layers of history that go into making a city what it is? Is it the built form, the technology, the development, the economics? Is that what truly makes a city? Is it the arteries, which is the transportation systems, the buses, the trains? Is this what truly makes a city? Or is it what we perceive cities to be in things like simulations and games, like an Age of Empires or a Monopoly or a Sims? Or are cities what we perceive to be in fiction and in movies, like the screenshot from Game of Thrones? So, what do you think truly makes a city what it is? So, the way Jan Gehl puts it is what I say truly sums up how a city is and how a city should be designed, wherein he says it's first the life, and then the spaces, and then the buildings, and the other way around never works when you design for streets and spaces. And by life here, he refers to the people, their interactions with each other, and their interaction with the spaces around them and the buildings, because the spaces and buildings are static in nature, and the dynamic nature comes only through the people who move through all of this, through the streets. And hence, there is an inherent need for cities to design street spaces and cities that prioritize for people. So in this short presentation, I'll quickly take you through three elements. One is, why do we need to design streets for people? How do we do this? Some pointers, and what are the benefits of doing so? So looking at the why, these are putting together the points that you observed. You have streets that provide for access to jobs, education, amenities, a lot of economic opportunities that happen on streets. You have social and recreational activities that happen on streets. You have streets that eventually become an identity to a city. When I say a Fort Kochi or a Pondicherry or such a name, what comes to your mind is an identity to a city which the character has developed over time through the interaction of all these elements, but most importantly, the people and their interaction. So the things that you observed from a mobility perspective, there were people walking and cycling, you had public transport, you had motor vehicles, you had public spaces related things. You had people gathering, you had vending on the streets. You had a cross-section of people from pedestrians and cyclists to children, men, women, those who are dependent, the elderly, the differently able. You have a large cross-section of people, a large number of activities, and many other elements for these people. And yet, sadly, most of the cities in this world are designed as conduits for vehicles, though a street plays a much bigger role. All right, so for those of you who might be dozing off, if you can hear me, please continue to do so. For the others, just close your eyes for a minute. I will take you through a scenario where I would like you to close your eyes and imagine the same. All right. So imagine that it's probably 9:30 at night. You are in a new neighborhood trying to find your way to your friend's house, and you're walking in that neighborhood. So you're walking down the street alone, and there is no one else on the street. It's 9:30, it's quite dark. You're looking at the GPS on your mobile, and you continue to walk. You enter this narrow street, which is deserted. The only light that is guiding you as you keep walking is the moonlight and a flickering lamppost that's ahead of you. The other lampposts along the street are broken. It's not working. You have one side of the street having a tall wall, next to which there are a lot of abandoned vehicles, and you have some shady noises that you start hearing from there. You keep walking and you suddenly have an immense sense of fear gripping you all of a sudden, a fear for your personal safety, and you somehow want to get out of the street. So you start increasing the pace of your steps, and you rush towards the junction right in front of you at the intersection. So as you reach the intersection, you look to your left and right, and you cross the road when all of a sudden, a large bus at a quick speed just narrowly turns the edge, crosses you, and you have a near-death experience. And you stand there with your heartbeat racing, trying to imagine what just happened. Well, this is something which I'm sure was not so difficult to imagine for any of you, because this is something which all of us experience probably on a daily basis, and all of us would have experienced this at some point in our life at the least. So this is a sad reality of most of the cities and the roads in the cities in India that we live in. And the fear that you could relate to is something which is often a reality for most people. Statistics show that there are nearly 55 accidents in an hour. 55 accidents in an hour that happen in the country. And there is an increasing population of pedestrians and cyclists who are involved in this and are killed. So count yourself lucky if you haven't been in one yet. So these posters that were shared earlier for the presentation sum up the same as the reason why this is happening is because the streets are not designed well. So interestingly enough, if you look at the mode share comparison of different transportation modes in India, two-wheelers and cars, which occupy only 27% of the trips, occupy nearly 75% of the entire road space. Whereas walking and cycling, which constitutes a 48%, which is actually extremely high compared to many other top-tier cities in India, the spaces are not designed for them. It's time for a change in perspective. And how do we do this? Simply put, we start designing for spaces that prioritize for pedestrians, cyclists, and public transportation before motorized transport. So the next section is about how do we design streets for people, which I will be putting in a nutshell, that we can achieve this by designing for complete streets. A complete street is a street that caters to the needs of different cross-sections of the users through equitable allocation of road space. So as you see in the cross-section here, there are elements above the street and below the street. You have the underground utilities, which have to be well designed as well. And because it's not done so well is why we often complain, why is there a digging happening in our next street every 3 or 4 months later? You have elements above the street, which have to be equitably designed, from livability elements through spaces for public transport, through spaces for parking and whatnot. To quickly give you a glimpse of what the principles are, there are 6 principles. The first one is that of efficient mobility, which I touched upon now, that it's about allocating space equitably for all users. The second is achieving safety for the users through different design measures, through safe crossings, to safety brought through sufficient lighting, through zones that have speed limits, and how to reduce the speed for vehicles. You have universal accessibility that is brought in through continuous and even surfaces and many other design elements, which is a big difference, a big impact for a large population of the people. You have elements of livability that needs to be designed for, from play elements through places where you interact, street vending. You have the need for sensitizing to local context. How, if a street is in a neighborhood with a temple character, how the character can reflect on the street. If it's next to a school, how that reflects on a street. You have elements of environmental sustainability also, which has to be embedded when you design all these elements as well. So these are some principles that will certainly take away the fear that you experienced on a daily basis. So as a step towards disseminating information on how to design streets, this is something which has to be tackled at different levels, from a policy level to a master planning to design and implementation. So a set of guidelines were put together as a complete streets toolkit under the Smart City mission by ITDP, and this is available on our website for you to go in detail. So I'll just quickly take you through glimpses of a few of them of what they speak about. So there is a workbook on policy, which stresses the need for cities to adopt non-motorized transport policies, the need for doing it, how to do it, and how a strong institutional setup should back this. There is a toolkit on planning, the need for creating an integrated network for walking and cycling and not have fragmented segments. So how can cities do this? So a step-by-step guidance targeted at officials in cities. You have engineers, planners, and other consultants who work with cities. And you have design workbook, which guides the designers of how to do it. Like you have the building codes for a particular building, you have guidelines for street design of how it should be done as per the best practices. And most importantly, you have implementation of how implementation should be done right. Quickly looking at the benefits of doing all of this. So this is a case in Bangalore where there was a 250% increase in the pedestrian volumes after the transformation that you see from the left to the right. This is in Copenhagen where there's a vibrancy brought in, where the picture on the left is something that some cities in India, we can say is, and how it was changed into a pedestrianized space that increased the foot count, that helped in improving the economies of the shops next to it. You have accidents for pedestrians that are reduced by 35% in this case in New York. And this case in Buenos Aires, where 63% of the travel time, 63% of the entire travel time was reduced for the commuters and indirectly having a trickle-down effect impacting their lives in many ways. So these are just some examples. And what we often hear is people saying, oh, come on, this happens in Europe or somewhere else, but it doesn't work in India. But many Indian cities under the Smart City mission especially are working towards bringing this change. And I'll just quickly take you through some pictures of transformation that has happened in India. So this is a before image of the pedestrian plaza project that's happening in Chennai and how it's transformed into this right now. So change is possible, and cities are working towards it right now. This is a Harrington Road again in Chennai, the before and the after that you see. The before and the after of yet another street. So how bringing in these elements of complete streets that were discussed earlier, contextualizing it to the particular street, and how it brings a drastic change. So you have continuity of services, which is an issue here. You have extremely high walkable areas. So how that's made continuous, it's more safer for students and parents. So this is the before in Binny Road in Chennai and how the transformation is. So you can see how people are now using it much more. They feel safer, there's more vibrancy. This is another case in Chennai. And these are some cases in JM Road in Pune, where you see a very different character altogether. So many cities are now working towards in this journey, and I'm sure the Q&A session will give us more insights from all the panelists that are part of this on how the cities are doing this and what are the challenges that we face. So this is what the cities should be working towards, and they're working towards right now. So back to you, Archana.
Thank you so much, Venu. That gives a lot of perspective to our discussion going forward. I will now ask our esteemed panelists a few questions, and we now start the panel discussion. To start off with, for those who don't know, Tamil Nadu was the first state to adopt the non-motorized transport policy that prioritized people who were walking and cycling. So Raj, I would like to start this panel discussion by asking you, why is it important to incorporate NMT or non-motorized transport as a policy at a state level?
First of all, thanks for the opportunity. I think ultimately policy matters, but I'll have to caution everybody. But ultimately policy matters because after all, any city, any country, any state is governed through policies, laws, rules, and so on. But we have to understand that policy alone in a vacuum has no meaning, because it may in fact increase frustration by saying, you have a policy, but nothing translates on the ground. So I think it's a combination of many things. Policy is very important, but to get to the policy, you need to do very thoughtful projects so that people understand that such and such things are possible. Like Venu pointed out, it can be done in Copenhagen, it can be done in Singapore, but it cannot be done in Chennai, cannot be done in Mumbai, cannot be done in India. So we started off long back with actual work on the ground. Many of them failed. Many of them were miserably big failures. But actually it was terrific successes because it completely changed the way bureaucrats and engineers started thinking about this. And from that came the policy. So I have to caution that policy may be very easy to do, because if you get a sympathetic bureaucrat, and they'll be very happy to help with the policy. But translating that into actual action is very difficult. I'll also say this, that nothing stops a city in India today from doing either a flyover or a pedestrian plaza. Yeah, there's no policy required to do a pedestrian plaza. But obviously, in the long run, if you want to push society towards a certain budgeting pattern, whether whether you want to do more flyovers or do you want to do more pedestrian plaza and footpath, policy matters. So I think things have to happen in parallel. It has to be one feeding into the other. Because I'm emphasizing that is because a lot of times we end up just trying for the policy, and that could get frustrated because policy is there and nothing happening on the ground. So we have to do multiple things to get to the policy to be actually functional.
Thank you, Raj. So for emphasizing that on-ground projects and impact is also as equally important as policy. So Sanskriti, opening up to you, from your experience working on the Pune Cycle Plan, could you share with us what is an NMT network plan and why must cities create such plans?
Hi, Archana, and thanks. Yeah, I agree with Raj that it's important to have a good policy. And, going forward from a policy, it's important to actually do detailed planning. And we are actually talking about a few different levels here. And the cycle plan must be not only like a cycle network or the physical plan, but also that the whole transportation planning needs to be cycle inclusive. So that's like a larger context and a larger layer where demotorization and removal of multi-lane one-ways, or the on-street parking that needs to be regulated, which provides an environment in which provides a cycle inclusive environment. Now, creating a full city network, it's of course the set of cycleways in the city with which one can access major destinations in the city using a cycle. But having a clear network plan makes it visible and recognizable that this is what we are going to do. I just want to share my screen for a minute. Are you able to see this?
Yes, yes, Sanskriti, we can.
Okay. So, these are basically the characteristics.
I'm sorry, Sanskriti, could you and make it full screen so that everybody can see it?
Yeah. Are you able to see this better?
Yes.
And you're still able to see it?
Yes, Sanskriti.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Yeah. So essentially that, having a full cycle network which is coherent, basically you should be able to easily find it. You should have the freedom of choice of routes and the continuity of routes, and you can see the complete network. And the second principle is basically that people should be able to find direct routes and not have to take long detours, so that cyclists, they can get to different places without too much delay. And then a cycle network needs to have safety. And so the cycle network actually defines the cycleways and reduces the encounters with motorized traffic. And then comfort, of course, is also related to the smoothness of the road surface and that you're able to actually negotiate your way easily. And attractive in terms of the experience of the surroundings and the sense of social safety. And these need to be applied at the whole, the network level, as well as at the intersection level, and at segments of roads. So having this clear, coherent, direct, safe, comfortable, and attractive cycle network is an essential element of cycle planning, and actually translating a policy into something which is an on-ground environment which is safe for cyclists. So here in Pune, For example, so this is what the network looks like. It has segregated cycle tracks and also painted cycle lanes and greenways. And, so these are sort of defined cycleways, but the interior roads also need to have traffic calming. So in an interior road, which is maybe just a few meters wide, and it's not got a lot of traffic, you won't do segregated tracks there. But on fast moving wide roads where there's a lot of motorized traffic, you want to segregate the pedestrians and cyclists out of the way of the fast moving motorized traffic. So a network would have different hierarchies, and it would keep cyclists safe and provide them direct, comfortable routes in this way. And so in the cycle plan, we actually created both this network as well as then the design guidelines, which describe how the treatment has to be at different types of functionalities of roads. Okay, now I want to stop sharing, and I have to locate how I stop sharing. Yeah, okay.
Thank you, Sanskriti, for that. So moving from like a plan, the policy, the plan, to actually decision making. So the next one's for you, Raj. So for NMT projects, have multiple city agencies involved in the decision making process. Could you tell us how this has impacted the projects?
So I think, like I always joke that, in any society, democracy or dictatorship, we will debate whether a table should be plastic, chair, concrete, etc., which is a good debate to have. Yeah, I mean, you're supposed to have that debate. The good thing is that in Hong Kong and places, they did this 50 years ago. Here we are doing it now, and that too among multiple agencies. So what happens is that you have to be patient enough in any city to around, let's say, 3 to 5 years, when they are very, very positive about everything, for everybody to understand philosophically, materially, and engineering wise, spiritually, etc., that these things are important in the first place. But then the question becomes, how do you implement a parking policy? Because without a parking policy, NMT fails. How do you push more people into buses and metro rails? Otherwise, just the sheer congestion will cause you not to have footpaths, and so on and so forth, right? So not only does coordinating among the various agencies very, very difficult in any city on earth, I'm sure, but especially in Indian cities, extremely difficult. Because simple example, you want to put ducting and this and that in a road, right? The water lines and the sewage lines matter, because you have to make a critical decision. Do you want to give rider sewage or rider water? Police department is at the state level. So they have terrible headache every day to deal with traffic. And suddenly you're now going and telling them to reduce carriageway. It's completely counterintuitive. So you need to make sure that many years you've worked with them and they're convinced that these kinds of things actually work in their favor. Parking management, does the traffic police do it or does the corporation do it? That's a big debate, because enforcement is traffic police, actual collection of money is corporation. So I think any city that in India that's going to do all this needs to work not just on NMT, but all the peripheral issues. So vendors, for example, middle class and rich get very irritated by vendors because they need a space. And you create a new footpath and somebody goes and sets up a shop in the middle of the footpath and people get irritated. So even though we say NMT, it's actually a very, very complicated set of projects and policies that need to go parallel. So in Pedestrian Plaza, for example, we are dealing with parking management system. We're dealing with cycle sharing there. We're dealing with all the ducting and stormwater drain and all those issues, because people may say, look, okay, the road gets flooded. What's the point of having Pedestrian Plaza if the road gets flooded? Then you have the philosophical issue of, should you give space for pedestrian or should you give space for cars? That was fought like 8 years ago, for example. So a lot of these pieces need to be falling in place for the policy to get translated into reality. So I know it sounds very complicated and scary, but there is no alternative, because that's the reality. It's not we're dealing with cities with millions of people, all with different ideas. And even a poor person without a car will argue for cars, right? I mean, that's the state of affairs in India. They're very upset that road carriageway is getting reduced, even though they may most probably never buy a car in their life, right? So I think there's a long way to go. Communication, coordination among the various people, departments, various policies which may not even appear to be NMT, like I said, vendor policy, parking policy, and so on. So we have to be very careful that we parallelly address these various pieces and various departments. Otherwise, just when you're trying to do a footpath, the 10 other departments come and say you cannot do it because for genuine reasons. From their point of view, it's genuine. So I think you need to work on all these different pieces for you to be able to get even a kilometer of decent footpath.
Okay, that's enlightening and also very overwhelming. But Venu, you've had some experience in this front when you were coordinating with multiple agencies yourself. Could you tell us what your take on this topic is?
Yes, Archana, I think Raj has very well summed up how complex the picture is, and it's not what someone who complains for a problem sees. There is much that happens behind. But I'd like to just point out from my experience how the scenario that many colleagues correlate is the fact that if you take a street itself, a simple street, you have many agencies that go into it. Like Raj pointed out, you have sewerage, you have electric poles, you have probably landscape elements or a green space. Many agencies work in that space. However, in most Indian cities, this interaction between the agencies is extremely fragmented. And the way people put it, they say that it's in silos, that they all work in their own space. And the impact of this can be extremely negative because of the fact that if you look at a football team, for example, if you imagine that everyone just holds on to the ball or is playing in their own space, it hampers the whole play for the team to achieve the target. So there is, from our experience, there is an angle of development of capacity on one angle that needs to be looked at for agencies. The fact that when consultants work with a particular agency more over time and probably help in capacity building or work together on one front, the moment you're not able to create that same rapport with other agencies that are as much involved in the projects, when it comes to implementing or designing the project, you face pushbacks from different areas that you never saw that was there earlier. So hence there are cases where cities adopt things like an urban metropolitan transport authority kind of a system, which is being right now tried by many Indian cities, wherein you have a transport authority, wherein you have the key stakeholders in the city from the different agencies sitting together, brainstorming, and they're part of all the projects that happen. Because right now you have one department pushing for a particular project or a particular master plan, you have another department going their own ways, coming up with their own numbers. Everyone's doing their job. But the coordination is something which, from my point of view, is something which, if synchronized and improved, which will largely improve the process, but it's easier said than done, like Raj said. But having said this, many Indian cities are right now working towards improving that. Chennai, through my limited experience, is one case where it's largely improved over time. There are projects of tactical urbanism which we are involved in on ground, where when all the agencies were brought on the same page, the impact was extremely strong. All of them knew that they were on the same line of thought, and the impact that it brought to the space was extremely large. Back to you, Archana.
Thank you, Venu. Thank you for bringing up design consultants. So my next question, maybe Sanskriti, you can take the lead, is how important is a good design consultant?
Yeah, Archana, before I just go to the design consultant, I just want to, draw your attention to, also the previous question on the institutional framework, because there is, of course, this, the formal systems of institutional framework, which is the policies, laws, and institutional coordination mechanisms. But we also should reflect on the informal cultural institution and the ethos for promoting NMT in our cities, and sadly that, because these are informal institutions which kind of impede or can progress in NMT implementation. And sadly, due to gender, class, and age aspects in our society, sometimes where young and middle-aged men have often the priority as decision makers or breadwinners, and the public that uses motorized modes are often more articulate and visible, and the tendency has been really to favor motorized modes over the non-motorized modes and public transport modes. And we also hear about aspiration for cars and bikes, which is often strongly promoted through advertising, which also reinforces these cultural institutions. And then public policy and decision making falls into this trap of reflecting these biases. And so we have this sort of dichotomy in our present time. So I think to re-emphasize like formal institutions that support NMT and sustainable mobility planning, like, we have the development plan or the National Urban Transport Policy, which is the set of policies or procedures or plans which are in fact approved through democratic processes by municipal general bodies or by the state government or by the central government. These need to be kind of re-emphasized to say, and we really need to rethink how we can reshape the cultural and informal institutions and ethos to support sustainable mobility. And also, I just wanted to add that in Pune, what we're trying to do now with the Pune Cycle Plan, which was in fact approved by the general body in December 2017, is to notify it in the master plan. And the master plan becomes, a very important institutional framework in the city to implement programs and projects. And also, there's an NMT cell which is being created under the road department. And I agree that this institutional capacity and technical capacity, as well as detailed procedures for interdepartmental cooperation and allocation of budgets. And another thing that we've tried to do in the bicycle plan, and hopefully, as the road department has the capacity, the technical capacity to host the NMT cell, is also that it's the responsibility of the NMT cell to orient various other departments about the why and how of implementing the NMT plan, so that they become your partners in implementation. Now, coming to your design consultants question, I think it's pretty crucial because in some of these cities where we are seeing these transformation happen, I think they have taken on board good urban design consultants and professionals who are clear about the direction we have to take for sustainable mobility design. And they are able to visualize the system at the system level as well as at the elemental level, what treatment is to be given at when space is a constraint. It's quite good to do in a greenfield situation, but when you're actually looking at a very complex urban situation with a lot happening, and then how do you create the detailed design thinking through the myriad situations that our cities have. I also want to say a little more about what type of design professionals, because it's not only about urban design professionals. It's also about creating other types of design process, and it's also institutional design and public engagement design that is quite important.
Understood, Sanskrit. To summarize, you're saying it just shouldn't be urban planners, but also people who have technical expertise in public engagement. Correct?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's institutional design, it's public engagement design, it's communication design, because it's not, this transition that we are looking at is not just physical design. It's actually attitudes and actually enabling the transition, because it's going to be a messy transition, and it's always been a messy transition. And, when you're trying to take space away from parked vehicles, which people hold really dear, it's a difficult political situation as well. And therefore, it's really important to focus on how you design public engagement too.
So it is to bring together a team that has different technical expertise. Raj, what is your take on it?
Obviously, you wouldn't build a huge building without a consultant, architect, etc., plumber, and so on and so forth. So obviously it's very important. And how we went about in Chennai around 10 or so 12 years ago is that initially we didn't have these kinds of concepts. So we got progressive architects who interested in volunteering, did this. Then we convinced the city, and they were easily convinced, that is the amount spent, for example, on these consultants are peanuts compared to the actual project, right? And the problem is that typical Indian city, when they do something, is that they don't have any design, they don't have anything. And then the local engineer takes, if at all he or she has time to take decision, he takes random decisions. So even simple things of where do you keep the bollard, what do you do around a tree? If the lamppost and the bollard and the tree are blocking the footpath, after, even though 90% of it is wheelchair friendly, that 5% is not wheelchair friendly. You'll have to, get off the wheelchair off the road. So all those elements can be captured only when you have good design consultants. But a very important cautionary note is that, again, we shouldn't idealize these things, because when we say design consultant, and typically what happens is it will be architects and urban planners. Yeah, we shouldn't automatically assume that these architects are also pro NMT. And that's something people make a mistake of doing, because they themselves are car owners, and they themselves may have been trained in, let's say, Houston, Texas, and they're not going to come back and say, let's do great Copenhagen public space. This is where standards matter, right? So what is the city emphasizing on standards? And not only that, forget that, even if they were well-meaning, right? What do you do around a tree is not a simple problem. It's not like a straight line, because it's a compromise between car parking versus wheelchair access versus something else, and experience matters. So I think it is important that when you go through a tendering process, get a good consultant, preferably who has done this kind of project. But if you want to build a huge army of such architects, you need those architects themselves to be trained in how to design these things based on standards. So that's where ITDB manuals and how to design roads, etc., makes a big difference, because I know that ITDB, we ourselves have learned from our mistakes. Some concepts which work very well in the West, for example, bulb out, for example, can be a disaster in India sometimes.
I think you need to explain to everyone what a...
So bulb out is basically, you have a footpath curve, right? You have a road and you have a footpath, simply put. Bulb out is a piece of footpath that sticks out, for a lack of a better way of explaining. It could be for various reasons. Now, the way doors, shop entrances, etc., happens, let's say in New York City or US or Hong Kong, is very different from, let's say, Chennai. Right? Chennai has 1 million entrances into the footpath from every gate. This is not true in certain other countries. There are basic building structures are different, which means if you start putting bulb outs based on a Western standard, your whole road will be full of bulb outs. There'll be no parking left. So parking guy will come and really get upset, and so on and so forth. So a lot of those learnings over the years from Pune and Chennai and other cities, Ahmedabad and so on, have gotten into these manual. Because manual needs to be used for training of these consultants if they don't have experience, including the engineers of the city, because no matter what the consultant gives, is the engineer who's ultimately going to have to take the responsibility on the road, city engineer. So I think as much as I'm a huge believer in getting consultants, because there's a ton of work to be done and city engineers don't have the time to do it. But after you get that, it's very important that we have a first workshop for the contractors, first workshop for the engineers, even if they are experienced, to explain the design. And you have to assume that 10% of design is wrong, right? What survey was wrong, or the architect mistook it, or whatever the reason may be. That also need to be iterated, and you need to find compromises, which may not be in the standards, right? So it's a pretty complicated iterative process, but all these pieces need to be done. But all said and done, without a good consultant, don't even bother starting the project.
Understood. So capacity building for design consultants, but also have leeway and space for change. Okay, so swiftly moving on to our last question. So we'll keep it short in the interest of time. So from the decision makers and designers to people who are impacted, how important is it to involve stakeholders at every stage of the process? Sanskriti, would you want to take a lead?
Yeah. Yes, I think, it's the public which is the basis of decision making in a democratic context, and people are the basis of physical design as users. And in terms of creating policy in policy formulation, in program design and project implementation and actual implementation design, I think the public needs to be involved at all these stages. And I think there are now more and more examples of participation coming about. What we find, however, is that cities are not really able to carry out a lot of participatory processes, either for the public, as really in a democratic context, or even as for users. And sometimes it's because of a lack of understanding about why and how to conduct participatory processes, or there's a perception that there are too many chaotic voices, it takes too much time, or there are vested interests. And often, if not a fear of participatory, at least there's a lot of reluctance to conduct participation. And there are certain principles that need to be kept in mind. And first, when you're looking at public policy design or policy formulation, participation should be really anchored under the aegis of a formal institution, like say a municipal corporation. Second is that it needs to be inclusive of diverse viewpoints and values, and people who are marginalized, who often it's like pedestrians and cyclists, or there'll be elderly people or women who often get sidelined. So they need to be brought in, especially into the participation processes. And thirdly, it's often that when we discuss, and then people say that, oh, okay, if you just bring in lay people, they'll think that flyovers are the solution, and technically flyovers are not the solution. So the point is that the deliberation quality itself, the platform that you create, there we must have access to information and access to good practice, and have open dialogue, and the space to understand and reframe what's happening, and why certain kinds of designs could be more useful, or why it is seen as best practice. And finally, often what happens is that because the deliberation quality is not that great, or it's very uninformed kind of dialogue taking place, then there's reluctance to actually take in any input and use it in so there's a lack of sort of influence of the participation process in decision making. And so the point is that if you had a good informed dialogue, and then good material is coming out of it, it actually needs to inform decision making. And so we did try this in the creation of the Pune Cycle Plan. And we had sort of extensive public engagement through informing people that a cycle plan is under preparation through newspapers, and also through digital media, as well as through public consultations in all administrative wards of the city, even before we formulated the plan. And so that was basically to say that planning process is underway, and what suggestions do you have, and taking every suggestion in. And then also doing very focused discussions with particular stakeholders, like bicycle shops, with cyclist groups, as well as people who are non-cyclists and have been cyclists earlier, school representatives and young people, also corporate groups, and public bike share vendors, etc. And then using that input, and of course the technical studies that were done, then the draft bicycle plan was formulated, which was again taken into a second round of consultations. And so I guess that it was quite participatory as a plan formulation exercise. But I think as we go into implementation, we find that, again, a different type of participation design is needed, which needs to be, if you say that Aund, where I live in Pune, and we actually want to now transform this area with much better design. There now people need to be able to see what is the larger game plan, what is happening, because if you're going to remove parking, then what is going to take its place, and how will we actually, is there off-street parking? Are we really having better public transport connect? And I think this requires a different design strategy, maybe with mock-ups and charrettes, and as well as the presence of public authorities who tell you that this is part one of a larger process. There are other elements, Raj, for example, mentioned that this parking design is also, because without parking design and without the other pieces which form a transportation system also evolving, you may not really get good NMT design. And so the public also needs to be able to see that. And I think all of these are part of the process of public engagement design.
Thank you, Sanskriti. Thank you for that. In the interest of time, we're quickly moving on to the question and answer round. So, participants, you can enter your questions. I see a lot of questions already, but we're going to start taking one. And the first one I thought could be to you, Venu. Is that, just hold on a minute. So it's by Sumit Kumar Mishra. Venu, this is to you. In a country like India, he's saying where vehicles is considered an aspiration, and personal transportation is considered aspirational. So will it work unless we actually promote public transport and discourage personal transport?
A very interesting question, and I think Raj did touch upon this earlier. Well, this is something which is to be tackled at different levels, and that is what cities are working towards as well. You need to provide for good infrastructure for public transportation, good facilities. Only then will people have a choice to move on to that. In most cases, it is probably the lack of an alternative option which causes many people to probably take their own vehicle for convenience and comfort, travel from, or probably because there is a metro stop probably a kilometer away, but there is no good connectivity for that person from their house to that metro station. There's no last mile connectivity that is designed for. So there are various elements like he pointed out, which needs to be designed and needs to be looked at the same time when an NMT plan itself or a policy comes into place. So as consultants working with the city, we prioritize these elements and work on them. So Raj, would you like to pitch into the same?
So the question was that will NMT policy actually work unless we discourage?
It's like this, right? See, I think it is very misleading if we only talk about one set of projects. A city happens in, I always joke that the societies happen in parallel. You need to do many complicated projects in parallel. There is no silver bullet where we do just NMT and some magic happens, or simply put 1,000 buses on the road and magic will happen. So in terms of this topic, you have to think in terms of there are carrots and there are sticks. A good city, I always like to ask myself, what does a Hong Kong do? What does a Tokyo do, right? So because none of us here have the experience of running a city like Hong Kong and so on. We only know what we know from our own experience in India. What do? They have carrots, they have sticks. They have, I'm sure they didn't get to that Hong Kong level in overnight. They went all the way from TOD. I'm sure they got it wrong, they got it right. They went bus, they did metro rail on all these carrots that they did. And they did sticks. They tried congestion charge, like in Singapore they've done, and London they've done. They've done serious parking policy. I'm sure they must have gone through n number of technologies over the years to get to where they are. So I think my suggestion to all the people listening, I'm sure all of you are interested in these topics. There is no one policy or one thing that's going to save our cities. We're starting from a very big mess. So the problem, the scale of the problem is so enormous that it's amazing that we're not depressed and given up. The point is you need to do a lot of different things. As we build footpaths and fail and succeed, we have to do bus policy and more buses and this and that. We need to, as we do gender related policy, we need to build more public toilets. We need to build more, plant more trees. We need to, I mean, there's endless things to be done. So there is no one policy. And the other flip side is to say, not to say, NMT won't succeed until when you do bus. Bus won't succeed until when you do parking. But this typically I hear every day. Well, how can you do this until when that hasn't been done? Or parking policy should come first before you do. I would argue all this needs to happen in parallel. And we need to accept the fact that we will fail many times. We will succeed only 60% of the time. We may succeed 80% of the time. But we don't have 1,000 years to do things in series. Like, first I'll do 10 years of parking, then next 10 years I'll do buses, then next 10 years I'll do footpath. All needs to be done in parallel. And I know most people don't like that answer because we think in a very idealized environment where we're doing things perfectly and cleanly and nicely. This is, as Sanskriti pointed out, this is a huge mess, and it's going to be a huge messy process to transform ourselves into a Stockholm or a Hong Kong or whatever. So be prepared to do n number of complicated, painful projects in parallel. And all of them require policy, stakeholder, communication, all the things we talk about in seminars. Now it's time we act on the road, act on the ground, doing all these things in parallel.
Thank you, Raj, for that. So quickly moving on to probably our last question for the webinar. Maybe Raj, you could take the lead on that. There's an anonymous attendee who's asked, how does political interference affect projects?
In any society on earth, democratic or dictator or something else, there will be support and opposition, right? And I've never ever met a politician, I'm talking about a mid-level serious politician, high-level politician, who gets up in the morning and says, I want to do bad projects, right? Everybody wants to make great projects, get the name as the next Leak One or the next whoever. It's our job, whatever you call ourselves, technocrats, intellectuals, etc., to sell these projects to them. I'm a huge believer in color pictures, yeah? So most people have difficulty imagining a better future, especially in the Indian context, because I always joke that if you're surrounded neck deep in garbage, if somebody comes and tells you all this is going to be Paris and London tomorrow, you'll think I'm on drugs or somebody's on drugs, right? So color pictures matter, because somebody like an ITDB or an architect or somebody comes forward and say, hey, you have a 10-meter road, you can do this with it. Why? Because Japan did it, or Guwahati did it, or Shillong did it, right? So we need to be able to sell color pictures, for a lack of a better word, because color pictures speak to every kind of stakeholder. Yeah. So you can answer questions. Where are you going to park the car? Hey, there's a 2-meter here for parking car. What about the shade? You're going to plant tree there. What about the water logging? So I think it's our job to sell the project, and there'll always be interference, because let's say a shopkeeper interferes with the project. The politician has no choice but to come and try to stop the project, because hey, that's what he's there for. So when you say stakeholder, we shouldn't idealize and say all the stakeholders are going to be like, coming and supporting us. But idea is that we need good groundwork, communication, color pictures, etc., to sell the idea, vision to the public, vision to the politician. And I can tell you from experience, very few politicians come and say, I want to do bad projects. They all want to do amazing projects. It's just that our system doesn't have the capacity to give them good projects. This is why we end up retarring the road over and over again, planting the same tree over and over again, or building simplistic projects like flyovers or digging up places. So I think it's our job to create those visions. And another very important thing is, what politicians are looking for is somebody who can translate those visions into ideas. It's easy. What happens is most of us may give ideas and run off, and they are stuck with the ideas, right? Media will keep asking, what happened? You promised this and that last 2 years ago, nothing has happened. So I think we need to help them. I'm not idealizing the situation, but we need to help them not only sell the vision, we should also build the capacity and be there to execute those projects so that they can take the credit and hopefully win the next election or whatever.
Yeah, I just want to add to this. What you say, Raj, is absolutely right. But, also, I think the politicians or the elected representatives, they're also, looking for what their constituency is asking. And that's why the need for, sustained, not only public participation, but also just basic, communication and education, or, it's really sustainability communication about both the direct benefits of sustainable mobility design, as well as, the larger the climate change and the equality related, because there are all these are triggers which are absolutely relevant and connected to good NMT design. And the public needs to not just follow because they're sold on a vision or it's aspirational or something. They actually need to understand that what is this transition that we must have, and the transparency and the fact that there is this lot of experimentation going on. Much more good communication is absolutely essential to create the conditions for innovation and experimentation to happen. That the public authority needs to be able to say that this is what we're trying to do. This is the reason that we're trying to do it. And the public needs to be able to say, yeah, this is working, or this is not working, or okay, we will bear the pain for now, given that there is perhaps a better future ahead. But this must be underpinned by good communication, which explains what is happening and why it is happening and how long it's going to happen.
Thank you, Sanskriti. Okay, so one more question, and that will be the last one, I promise. So this is, I think, something all three of you can contribute, but maybe Venu, you can take the lead on it. So Anushri Alatagi asks that how do we come up with NMT solution and cycle tracks in cities like Bangalore, where there's a constraint for space and the roads are very narrow. I think it's applicable to other cities like Chennai and maybe even Pune as well. So Venu, would you want to take the lead on that question?
Yes, Archana. I'd actually just type down a reply to that on the chat box. The fact that narrow streets, we do need to study how the context is, but narrow streets, there are other tools that can be used for design, and it's not required to provide for a cycle track, a demarcated space as such. There can be speed calming measures that are brought into the design. And the point is to make it comfortable for the cyclist to use the space. That's what a cycle track or a cycle lane aims to achieve. So in narrow streets where it's difficult to demarcate spaces, the shared street concept could be used. So depending on the neighborhood and the space, other tools could be used. And these fragments that you designed for will eventually connect to the cycling network, which largely would run through the arterial primary network in the city.
Raj, would you want to pitch in?
So I think, yeah, see, first of all, we've learned a lot from Bangalore. Hats off to Bangalore for the tender show work done. I think I'm sure they went through hell to get to where they are, because I'm sure a lot of people must have criticized saying, how can you reduce a carriageway and put footpaths when you hardly imagine Bangalore traffic and so on. So Bangalore actually has shown us the way of how to proceed on these fronts, and some of the roads they've done is spectacular, including what Venu pointed out. Number of pedestrians walking on those roads have actually dramatically gone up. So I think the approach they have done, I suppose, is they have probably taken an area view of it. So instead of looking at things from a road by road point of view, I would suggest you look at an area point of view. So you can always say that, look, certain roads need not be two ways, need not be one way, need not be cars at all. Some roads, obviously, you have to have two way. So I think if you look at it road by road, things may look impossible. But so for example, cycles, sometimes you can go through side roads with equal distance or less, rather than having to go only through main road. You know, I'm generalizing here, obviously, but like Sanskriti pointed out, one of the criteria is short distance. You don't want to make the cycle guy go longer and for just so that cars can go short distance. So I think look at it from an area point of view. And like I said, I think some of the, ITDP and others have done a lot of tactical urbanism where I think you need to be humble enough to realize that sometimes certain things are too ahead of its time. Because either you didn't ban parking there or you haven't arranged parking properly and the cycle track gets into trouble. So I would take the Sanskriti's approach of taking the cycle plans. So think of it like a city, like a cake. You have different layers, right? You have a cycle plan layer, you have a walking layer, and so on and so forth. So take an area and do these kinds of alternate analysis of what diversion, etc., can be done. And the next phase could be to do tactical urbanism to say, okay, you will put cones and paints and so on to test out these things. And then I think Vijay Kohli, he had answers about signals, and they play a critical role. Some places you may want to reduce signals so that people will move faster on that road and leave the other roads behind. And then sometimes you may want to play with signals to make sure that you're able to divert traffic to certain roads and not to certain roads. So I think, again, like I told you in the other, when answering the other question, I wouldn't recommend you take this as simply as a cycle issue or a walking issue. Look at it more comprehensively. Plus, for example, we always miss out the bus guys, poor guys. They're never in the discussion picture. They're like the unwanted people. So I think sometimes in the name of walking, cycling, or diversion of traffic, we end up shifting bus stands to places where nobody can even reach. So I think take a comprehensive approach. Don't look at it road by road, but then because it look impossible, look at it from an area point of view. And sometimes traffic calm street is far more practical than a dedicated cycle lane, and so on. So just last bit, I'll put it this way. Indian situation is extremely unique. I hate when somebody says that, because they'll say Indian is too unique, we can't do it. I'm putting it another way. When we stand in a Stockholm or a New York, and I always tell myself there's absolutely no traffic there. There's hardly any cars on the road. I mean, when a New Yorker complains there's traffic, I always laugh at them, right? So let's be humble. Indian situation is pretty messed up. Simply saying get rid of cars not going to happen overnight. So I think it is incumbent upon us to do serious planning and be humble and ask the tough questions ourselves before others ask. But look at it from an area point of view.
Thank you,
Yeah,
Raj.
I
And
just want to add a little bit here. Sometimes what happens is that there is a perception that the road has become narrow. Actually, because there is a lot of car traffic and bike traffic, it appears that it is narrow. And the idea of, say, like a dedicated bus lane, for example, is in fact to improve the capacity of the road. And it's precisely where it is, facing a lot of congestion due to increased motorized traffic, which is where you need to actually take away space from bikes and cars and give it to higher capacity modes, and that's how you increase the capacity of the road. I also have a little maybe diversion on the issue of one ways, because, the JM road picture that you showed the NMT part of it. The rest of it is one ways. It's like 4 motor vehicle lanes. Now, as a cyclist, when I'm on the left side and I want to go right, I have to cross 4 high-speed motor vehicle lanes. So one-way, really multi-lane one-way roads really need to be reconsidered and seen. Is it really helping sustainable mobility or not? In general, I mean, it's important to really look at networks and the overall city, and not just keep looking at 100 meters of cycle track or 50 meters of road and all that. Of course, you need to go into detailed design, but when you take up a new project, really the evaluation has to be: is it going to increase safety? Is it going to increase access? Is it really going to increase walk, cycle, and shared mobility and public transport? Or is it going to increase motorized traffic and therefore pollution and higher speed and maybe non-safety on roads? So, how we are assessing a project also, we really should be thinking about. Yeah.
yeah.
No, I think Sanskriti makes a good point. I think to sum up the entire topic we'd had for the last half an hour or so, I think first start from a plan. Don't look at road and predict whether it can be done or cannot be done, like BRT, whatever the topic may be, right? So what Pune is doing, I really admire what they're doing there. I hope Chennai will be able to do. Only when you have a plan done by people with experience and expertise can we have a debate about this junction or that junction. Otherwise, everything looks impossible. So I think first thing is, even if it's a draft plan, create a plan, and then I think the whole discussion changes, and things look far more doable.
Thank you. And with that, we come to the end of episode 4. Thank you, Raj, Sanskriti, and Venugopal for sharing all your experiences and reflections with us today. A big shout out to all the participants. It's been 4 episodes now, and we've noticed that there are about 50 odd of you who come repeatedly to all our episodes. So thank you so much for participating so consistently, and do come back for our upcoming episodes as well. We look forward to seeing all of you in our next webinar, which is on debunking parking myths by Ashwati Dilip, and there will be more panelists there as well. The whole crux of this upcoming webinar is to challenge basic notion that parking is a right for all and it should be free for all. So it challenges that fundamental notion. So do join us for the next webinar. The minute the screen closes, you will see a survey link. So for those who are very interested and who want to reach out to us, please leave your thoughts and your feedback, and do let us know what you genuinely think of the webinars so far. Thank you so much for joining us, and have a great day.
Thanks, Archana, Raj, Venu. It was great talking.
Thank you. Thank you, Sanskriti. Thank you, Raj. Bye-bye.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Good job.